And that also very nicely leads on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Professor sorry, let me get the right document. Our next speaker is Professor Ingmar Posner, who is a professor at Oxford Robotics Institute. And very nicely, he now has a background in AI and machine learning in robotics. So really, be really interesting to see kind of perhaps conflicting or even contrasting views to Helmut on the role of AI in robotics. And Ingmar's talk, I believe, is going to focus on robots thinking fast and slow. So really on the kind of the temporal role of AI. So Ingmar, thank you so much for joining us. So I will add you to the spotlight and hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. First of all, can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, both are good.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right. Okay. I know we're way over time, so I'll try and keep this reasonably brief. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Ingmar Posner. I lead the Applied AI Lab in Oxford. And Josie and Fumia have specifically asked me today to talk about something I've been advocating for the best part of a decade, which is really this notion about robots thinking fast and slow, dual process theory and metacognition in robotics. Okay, so this is not working. There we go. Things that we're currently excited about, of course, are generative models. Been excited about those for a while, but also things like how can we use large language models for chatbots, foundational models. Many people are asking the questions of what the foundation models are for robots. Good question. But ultimately, what it boils down to is while we have things like voice assistants in our homes, where are the robots? Where are those machines that work with, alongside us, and for us in such a way that we can sort of leverage them for everyday household tasks? And without wanting to go into the conversation about how machine learning is different from robot learning and so on, though there is a conversation to be had, it is true that our robots have a particular, list of desiderata, a wish list for our embodied intelligence. And I should say, when I talk about embodied intelligence here, I don't really mean, for example, morphology or embedded intelligence. I literally more broadly talk about agents that act and interact in the real world. Right. And so while the list might be unbelievably long, right, a couple of choice pieces might be, we would like real-time operation, ideally on the edge, so there are compute constraints, dealing with safety critical situations robustly, dealing with unknown situations, dealing with tasks creatively, whatever that may mean. At that point, everything gets a bit woolly, right? But bear with me, and we might get to that in a second. And one direction with which we have made quite a bit of progress along many of these lines, many of these axes, is of course machine learning. And if we think about what that is, you don't need an intro to machine learning. I just want to sync on some of the language I'm going to use. First and foremost, machine learning is an associative process, right? So you have inputs that get mapped to outputs, and you learn the mappings, those functions, right? In many ways, often when it is, for example, supervised, though the argument extends to unsupervised, you might think about an oracle that feeds it information, and that information that knowledge gets distilled into a machine learning model, which is sort of that blue sort of network blob in the middle there. Okay, so that's the kind of terminology that I'll be talking about, or that I'll be using. And the next thing, of course, that happened is the deep learning revolution. So we've been able to learn basic mappings for a very long time. But what deep learning really brought us is an ability to accurately learn some really, really complex mappings. That's great. But also an ability to execute these mappings very, very quickly indeed, right? And both of these things will become very, very important. And of course, an extension of that is the learning of structured latent representations. And a lot of my research life actually lives in that part, the structured latent representations, how we use them, but the argument extends. So let's talk about the kind of mappings that we would have seen in the past and the kind of mappings we're talking about. So gameplay is an obvious one. Ever since AlphaGo, we know that we can use a current state of a game and basically predict what kind of move we should take next. Autonomous driving has been on the horizon for a long, long time. So particularly when it comes to vision-based challenges here, we might take a current state or a current sort of image of what the vehicle sees. And we might want to predict where the vehicle might want to drive, for example. Intuitive physics has gained a lot of traction in recent years in the context of, we see a particular scene and we might want to say, well, actually, is that tower block stable or not? And also robot control. So, for example, we want a particular pose output, like this, the pose of this cube, as in the work by OpenAI here, and that then basically tells us how I should act. More recently, also an extension of that are world models, which are very, very popular right now, which is great. So this is not just saying is something stable or not, but it's also about predicting how the world will evolve over, a particular time horizon. And something that we've been very active in, which is planning in structured latent spaces via, for example, optimization in those spaces. And so that leads to trajectories in the latent spaces, like we see at the top right here. And I'll say a tiny bit more about those later. But it turns out that we end up with very, very robust plans for fairly complex robots, like you see at the bottom here, which are learned in a very, very unconventional way. Sadly, I don't really have time to talk about that much today. But if we put those things next to each other, we see sort of on the left side all the learned models, where we kind of have the different mappings there, right? And on the right side, we sort of see the oracles, the information that has gone into those systems, right? So, for example, for the mappings from, for cats, it might be supervisory signal labelings that come from humans. For gameplay, it might be rollouts of Monte Carlo tree search that has been captured in the learned model to be able to predict it, and so we don't have to do those rollouts necessarily. For the segmentation part, it might be the systems engineering and the many, many, many person hours that went into doing that in order to provide almost a free amount of label training data and sort of system level self-supervision, which we've done quite a bit of. For the intuitive physics part, it might be that you write down, the laws of physics and embed them into a simulator, or it might be that you've learned a world model specifically. And for the planning part, it might be, for example, that you have explored that space effectively with trial and error learning, reinforcement learning, and that, of course, in conjunction with the super exciting systems engineering, the really, really important stuff there, in order to make the whole thing tractable and compress a lot of experience into a few hours of learning. Okay, so we can put those things next to each other. And we might then point out that the execution of these learned models is actually really quite quick, while all the oracles are really quite effortful, okay? And that directly leads to this notion of fast and slow thinking, right? So slow here, we might mean that a lot of time is required to either gather the information or to compute the information from some other sort of more reasoning-based system and so on. But the idea is that we can sort of distill that knowledge from the oracles into a very fast executing system via the machine learning models. And that, as it turns out, has a direct analogy in cognitive science, which is known as dual process theory, which was first popularized by Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which essentially tells us that one facet that allows us humans to operate effectively in the real world is sort of the interplay between two systems. One on the left here is sort of a much more intuitive system, which is very quick. We don't really think about it much. It just sort of, we just execute it. And that fits in quite nicely with, for example, something that Aude said earlier about learning something repetitive. You repeat it until it literally gets into your muscle memory. It's that sort of thing. Whereas on the other side, you have the system two, the sort of reasoning, the much more deliberate, much more effortful system that really requires some resource, be that time resource or compute resource or energy resource and so on. And what I've done here is I've brazenly stolen the adjectives, or replicated the adjectives that Danny Kahneman uses in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, to describe these two systems. But it serves to sort of drive home some of the characteristics quite effectively. Now, question then is there such a thing as a dual process theory for robots? And by now a whole bunch of other people believe that actually there absolutely is. And that opens up a really exciting opportunity, because we can now, for the first time ever, really look at the machinery that is available to us in the cognitive sciences and compare and contrast with what we have available to us in the sort of machine learning, robot learning literature. So just to make it explicit, the analogy here is that system one, the intuition, are sort of the machine learned models, and how that relates back to the introduction here is really for the first time ever, we've been able to create systems that really provide us almost with this intuitive reflex-like quick response. Whereas, of course, we've been working on system 2 sort of reasoning approaches for a very, very long time. Now, if you're with me so far through this analogy, then sort of there's much more we can do with this. The first one is one that also Danny Kahneman pointed out, which is that intuition is effectively recognition. But if you want to push that further, you could also say, well, actually, creativity is actually association, right? And it also means that machines, just like humans, suffer from cognitive biases, right? In the sense that you might have adversarial examples that trigger your intuition, your machine learned model, to come up with a particular counterintuitive response to something. The other aspect, and the last aspect that where this is really quite important, is that one of the things that that humans actually are pretty bad at, and we have that in common with the machine learned model, is an idea of what we don't know. Okay, and much strife is caused by machine learning models that that suck at knowing when they don't know. And nicely, in this particular analogy, this notion of metacognition, this idea of thinking about thinking, of assessing your own certainty and how you come to a decision, fits this sort of this framework very nicely and very naturally, right? In the sense that metacognition is some form of arbitrary factor that arbitrates between the quick intuitive response and almost on demand sort of runs a check in the background, says, well, actually, do I really believe this? Do I know enough to actually execute my intuition? Is my intuition appropriate here? And so on. And so again, what that means is we can take those ideas from the cognitive science literature and sort of start to investigate what kind of things we might want to transfer across effectively, and also go the other way around, right? So what kind of things have been helpful in the sort of learning literature, what kind of mechanisms have been useful there, and what can we learn about sort of human metacognition from that space. So that's basically it. A dual process theory for robots. Much more to discuss. It's a pretty rich vision to explore, and I look forward to doing all of that with you in the conversation in a minute. If you like that sort of thing, it's part of a program grant that we're running here in the UK on sensing to collaboration. So literally the building blocks of embodied intelligence and metacognition, as you see here, is an explicit part of that, for the reason that there is a lot of interesting stuff to be explored. One last thing I'd like to say, because I've seen some comments earlier following Aude's talk around sort of, what representations might be like in humans. And again, without saying that this is how humans do it, going back to exploration of planning in structured latent spaces, what we see is trajectories emerge, which are similar to some of the trajectories I suspect that Aude sees in her manifolds. So there's lots of synergy in the work that I'm talking about now here, and that Aude mentioned earlier. But when we inspect the trajectories that emerge as machines, as sort of quadrupeds and arms perform reaching and walking tasks, it turns out that they look fairly similar to things that people have observed in computational neuroscience, right? In terms of limit cycles in neural populations. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an interesting analogy and something that sort of my team and a bunch of others are actively exploring. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.